Hi, I'm glad you're here, and I mean that in a very simple way. There's nothing you need to prepare before listening. You don't need to be in a good mood or a focused one. You don't need to understand anything right away. This is just a quiet moment, a small pause in the middle of everything else that keeps moving. Maybe you're listening while the house is finally quiet. Or maybe it isn't quiet at all, and this is just noise in the background of your day. Either way is fine. I want to start by saying this clearly. You don't have to fix anything while you're here. You don't have to take notes. You don't have to decide what this means for you. You can just listen. I've been thinking a lot about those long stretches of time when the body keeps going, but something inside is already tired. Not tired in a dramatic way. Not the kind of tired that comes after one bad night or one hard week. More like the tiredness that settles in quietly and stays. Have you ever noticed that kind of tired in yourself? The kind where nights don't really end. They just turn into mornings. Where sleep happens, maybe, but it doesn't feel like rest. Maybe you wake up already feeling behind. Maybe you go through the day doing what needs to be done, because it still needs to be done. And maybe no one around you can really tell how much energy that takes. If that sounds familiar, you don't need to nod or agree. Just notice what comes up when you hear it. Does your body react at all? Do your shoulders tighten, or do they drop a little? I'm not here to label anything you're feeling. I'm not here to define your experience for you. I just want to acknowledge that living in a state of constant effort can become so normal that we stop questioning it. Sometimes we don't even think of ourselves as exhausted. We just think this is how life feels now. So if you're carrying a quiet kind of fatigue, one that doesn't ask for attention but never really leaves, you're allowed to let it sit here for a moment. You don't have to explain it. You don't have to justify it. As we go on, we'll stay with that space, not to analyze it, and not to push it away. Just to look at it gently, the way you might look at something that's been with you for a long time. For now, take this as a place to settle. Nothing more than that. At that time, there wasn't a clear beginning to the pressure. No single day where things suddenly became hard. It was more like a slow build, layered over years, until the weight felt permanent. My days followed a rhythm that didn't really change. Work started early, stretched long, and rarely ended in a way that felt complete. Meals happened when they could. Sleep was something I planned for, but never quite reached in the way I expected. The schedule looked functional from the outside. Things were getting done. Decisions were being made. Conversations kept moving forward. But the balance was off. There was no consistent boundary between work and rest. No clear signal that the day had ended and it was safe to stop thinking. Even when the body was still, the mind stayed active, moving from one unfinished thread to another. At night, I would lie down expecting exhaustion to do its job. Sometimes it did, for a while. Other times, sleep came in short segments, light and easily broken. And often, it didn't come at all. It wasn't that I was worried about one specific problem. There wasn't a single thought looping over and over. It was more like the mind refused to shut down because it had learned that being on was the default state. You might know that feeling. When your body is clearly tired, but your thoughts keep scanning for what's next. Not because something bad is about to happen, but because something always needs attention. The days after those nights didn't change much. Morning still arrived, whether I felt rested or not. Responsibilities were still there, waiting. People still needed answers, direction, decisions. So, the day moved forward. I learned how to function on reduced sleep without making it visible. How to stay sharp enough in conversations. How to keep the pace steady, even when the margin for error was getting thinner. There was no moment built into the day that said, "This is where you stop." No natural pause where everything could be set down without consequence. Stopping felt like something that had to be earned, and there was never enough time to earn it. Stress, in that context, didn't announce itself loudly. It didn't feel like panic. It felt like constant engagement, like being slightly braced all the time. The body adapted in small ways. Sleep became lighter. Mornings became faster. Even rest started to feel like a task to complete efficiently. From the outside, life looked steady. From the inside, everything was calibrated to keep moving. That's how the pressure worked. Not as an emergency, but as a condition. Something ongoing, something that blended into the background until it felt normal. And when something feels normal long enough, you stop expecting it to be different. During that time, I was tired in a way that didn't fully show on the surface. I could still speak clearly. I could still make decisions. I could still respond when someone asked a question. From the outside, I looked steady. Inside, it felt different. There was a constant sense of running low, like a battery that never quite reached full charge anymore. Even after sleep, when it happened, I didn't wake up feeling restored. I woke up feeling like I was continuing something that had never really stopped. I knew I was exhausted. That part was obvious. But knowing it didn't automatically give me permission to slow down. There was a quiet conflict happening all the time. One part of me recognized the signs, the heaviness, the dull focus, the way small tasks required more effort than they used to. Another part kept insisting that stopping wasn't an option yet. Not because someone was forcing me. Not because there was a clear external threat. It was more subtle than that. It felt like if I paused, even briefly, things might slip. Details might get missed. Momentum might be lost. And once lost, it wouldn't be easy to recover. So I kept going. The lack of sleep changed how my body felt to me. It wasn't just tiredness. It was a kind of distance, like I was operating myself from slightly outside. Movements were familiar, but they didn't feel grounded. Sensations dulled, then sharpened at odd moments. Sometimes my hands felt restless for no clear reason. Sometimes my chest felt tight, not from fear, just from being constantly alert. Even stillness felt active, like I was bracing without realizing it. At night, when everything finally slowed down, that's when the disconnect became more obvious. Lying in bed, I could feel how worn out my body was, but it didn't respond the way it used to. Sleep wasn't something I could enter willingly anymore. It happened on its own terms, if at all. And when it didn't come, there was a strange mix of emotions. Not panic, not frustration, at least not sharply. More like resignation. A quiet awareness that the next day would arrive whether I was ready or not, and I would meet it in whatever state I was in. During the day, I stayed composed. I didn't talk about how tired I was. Not because I was hiding it intentionally, but because it didn't seem useful to explain. Everyone around me had their own responsibilities, their own pressures. There was no obvious place to put my fatigue where it would belong. So, it stayed internal. That's where the loneliness came in. Not the kind where you're physically alone. I was around people constantly. But the specific weight of being this tired, the kind that settles into your bones, wasn't something that translated easily into conversation. It felt personal, hard to name without sounding dramatic, even to myself. I started to question small things. My judgment, my resilience. Whether this level of strain was something I was simply supposed to handle better. Those questions didn't lead anywhere clear. They just hovered in the background, adding to the sense of imbalance. I wasn't falling apart, but I wasn't fully present either. I was functioning, adjusting, compensating, doing what was necessary to keep moving, and at the same time, I could feel that something essential was being drained faster than it could be replenished. If you've ever lived in that in-between space, not in crisis, not at ease, you know how hard it is to explain. You're still showing up. You're still reliable. You're just doing it on less than you have. At some point in the middle of all that movement, something subtle changed. Not around me, but inside. There wasn't a moment where I stopped everything or stepped back to reflect. Nothing dramatic happened. The days still looked the same. The nights were still uneven. But I noticed that the way I was talking to myself began to shift. Up until then, there had been a constant push underneath everything. A quiet insistence that I should be able to handle this better. That, if I adjusted a little more, focused a little harder, rested just enough, things would stabilize on their own. That voice didn't disappear. It just lost some of its urgency. Instead of arguing with the fatigue, I started to acknowledge it, not out loud, not as a statement to anyone else, just internally. This is how tired I actually am. There was no relief attached to that thought. No sense of permission or release. It didn't solve anything, but it was accurate. Before that, I had been constantly measuring myself against an expectation that no longer fit my reality. I was comparing my current capacity to an older version of myself and wondering why the gap kept widening. That comparison required energy. So did the resistance. Letting go of it didn't make me feel better right away, but it made things quieter, less tense. I stopped treating the exhaustion as a problem that needed to be argued with. It became a condition I was aware of, the same way you're aware of weather while moving through a day. You don't control it. You don't dramatize it. You adjust your pace. sometimes without even realizing you're doing it. There was something grounding about naming the limit instead of pushing against it. Not as a decision, but as a recognition. I'm operating on less right now. That acknowledgement didn't slow the days down. It didn't change the responsibilities. But it changed the tone inside. I wasn't bracing quite as hard anymore. I wasn't scanning constantly for proof that I was failing. The effort shifted from trying to override the fatigue to working alongside it. There was still tension, still strain, still moments where I felt stretched, thin, but there was less internal noise. I wasn't telling myself a story about what this meant long term. I wasn't turning it into a verdict about who I was or what I was capable of. It stayed contained in the present. This is the level of energy I have today. This is the state I'm moving through right now. That was all. It wasn't optimism. It wasn't acceptance in any polished sense. It was simply stopping the fight that had been happening quietly in the background for a long time. And in that smaller, more honest space, it became possible to keep going without constantly pushing past myself. Looking back now, I don't see that version of myself as someone who was doing something wrong. I don't see failure there, and I don't see strength in the way people usually like to frame it, either. What I see is someone responding to pressure the way many responsible adults do when the stakes feel high and the margin feels thin. They keep going. At the time, continuing didn't feel like a choice. It felt like the only available response. There were systems already in motion, expectations already set, people already relying on things staying upright. So, the body adapted, the mind compensated, energy was stretched and redistributed. From the outside, that kind of endurance can look impressive. From the inside, it doesn't feel like courage. It feels like necessity. That's something I understand more clearly now. When I think back on those long periods of exhaustion, I don't admire them, and I don't regret them. They simply make sense in context. Carrying responsibility changes how you relate to your own limits. You stop asking whether something is sustainable and start asking whether it's possible to get through the next stretch. And if it is, you do. That doesn't make someone weak. It doesn't make them strong, either. It makes them human under sustained pressure. What stands out to me now is not the fatigue itself, but how quietly it was handled. How normalized it became to operate while depleted. How little space there was to acknowledge it without feeling like something was being compromised. I didn't think of exhaustion as something dangerous back then. I thought of it as a private cost, something to manage internally so everything else could keep functioning. That way of thinking is subtle, and it's risky. Not because it leads to collapse right away, but because it disconnects effort from awareness. You keep pushing without regularly checking what that pushing is doing to you. Over time, fatigue stops being a signal and starts being background noise. And when that happens, it's easy to confuse endurance with worth. I didn't consciously believe that my value depended on how much I could tolerate, but the way I lived suggested something close to that. As if the ability to absorb strain without visible impact was part of what made me reliable. From this distance, I can see how misleading that equation is. Endurance is a capacity, not a measure. It says something about what a person can handle in a given moment, not about who they are. Back then, those two things were blurred. If I could keep going, it felt like I should. And if I struggled, it felt like a personal shortcoming, even when no one else framed it that way. Now, I see that continuing through exhaustion wasn't a moral act. It wasn't proof of commitment or dedication. It was a response to circumstance, and circumstances change. What also becomes clear with time is how isolating quiet fatigue can be. When tiredness is hidden well, it doesn't invite conversation. It doesn't create obvious friction. It just sits beneath the surface, shaping decisions, narrowing perspective, slowly reducing the range of what feels possible. I didn't notice that narrowing while it was happening. It felt normal to work within a smaller emotional and physical bandwidth. Normal to plan days around output instead of recovery. Only later did I recognize how much of myself was being compressed in that process. That recognition doesn't come with anger. It comes with clarity. I don't need to elevate that period into something meaningful to justify it. And I don't need to dismiss it as a mistake to move past it. It was a phase shaped by pressure, responsibility, and the belief that staying upright mattered more than staying connected to how I felt. Seen from here, the most important distinction is a simple one. My value didn't increase because I endured more. and it wouldn't have decreased if I had endured less. Those things were never linked as tightly as they felt at the time. For anyone listening who recognizes this pattern in their own life, there's nothing to diagnose or correct in that recognition. It doesn't require judgment. Sometimes, just separating who you are from what you've been carrying is enough to loosen the grip of that old equation. Strength doesn't live in exhaustion, and exhaustion doesn't take anything away from a person's worth. They coexist sometimes. That's all. Understanding that now doesn't rewrite the past. It just places it where it belongs as part of a larger story, not the standard by which everything else is measured. From where I am now, what stays with me most isn't the exhaustion itself. It's how much effort went into explaining it away, mostly to myself. I used to think that being tired required a reason that made sense, that it had to be justified by something visible or measurable. If I couldn't point to a single cause, it felt easier to dismiss the fatigue than to acknowledge it. What I understand differently now is simple, but it took time to settle. Being tired doesn't need a defense. It doesn't need to be compared to anyone else's load to be valid. Fatigue is not a claim, it's a state. When I finally stopped treating exhaustion like something I had to earn the right to feel, the pressure inside softened. Not because the responsibilities disappeared, they didn't, but because I wasn't arguing with reality anymore. Acknowledging how tired I was didn't make me less responsible. It didn't make me less committed. If anything, it made the boundaries clearer. There's a difference between avoiding responsibility and understanding capacity. I used to blur those two things together. I assumed that naming limits meant lowering standards. Now I see that limits exist, whether we name them or not. Ignoring them doesn't remove them, it just makes them harder to work with. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself somewhere in it, the long stretch of holding things together, the quiet fatigue that never quite resolves, there's nothing incorrect about that experience. You're not failing some invisible test of resilience. You might be someone who carries a lot without announcing it, someone who keeps showing up because that's what the situation seems to require. That pattern doesn't mean you're doing life the wrong way. It means you've adapted. What I'd offer, if anything, is not a solution but a perspective. You don't have to translate your tiredness into something productive for it to be allowed. It doesn't need to teach you a lesson. It doesn't need to lead to a change you're not ready for. Sometimes it's enough to let it be what it is. I also learned that admitting fatigue doesn't automatically lead to collapse. That was a fear I carried for a long time, that if I acknowledged how depleted I was, everything I was holding would fall apart. That didn't happen. What happened was quieter. I became more accurate with myself, more aware of where energy was going and where it simply wasn't available. That awareness didn't tell me what to do next, and that was okay. You don't owe anyone, including yourself, a plan just because you're tired. You're allowed to exist in that state without immediately transforming it into progress. If there's anything reassuring I can say from experience, it's this. Recognizing exhaustion doesn't trap you in it. It doesn't define the future. It just names the present more honestly. And honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, tends to create more room than denial ever did. Whatever you decide to do or not do with that recognition is yours. There's no correct response timeline, no benchmark to meet. You can hold responsibility and fatigue at the same time. You can care deeply and still be worn down. Those things don't cancel each other out. I don't have certainty to offer here. Only the reassurance that feeling this way doesn't mean you've misread your life. Sometimes it simply means you've been strong for a long time, quietly, without much margin. Thank you for staying with me through this time, for giving a part of your attention to something that doesn't ask for urgency or reaction. I know that listening itself takes energy, especially when life is already full. So I don't take that lightly. Everyone who hears this is arriving from a different place, different responsibilities, different histories, different levels of rest, or lack of it. There isn't one rhythm that fits all of us. What feels manageable for one person might feel heavy for another, even on the same day, and that difference doesn't need to be explained or compared. If any part of what I shared felt familiar, you don't need to hold on to it. And if it didn't, that's fine too. This wasn't meant to define your experience or point you toward anything specific. It was simply a moment to pause and recognize a state that often goes unnamed. As this comes to a close, there's nothing you need to carry forward from here. No idea to remember, no feeling to maintain. You can return to whatever your day holds in the same way you entered this space, without obligation, I appreciate you being here, in whatever condition you're in today. Whether you listened closely, or only caught fragments along the way, this is where I'll leave it. Steady, unfinished in the way real life usually is. Thank you for listening,